Okay, because he's just finishing off Zachary Taylor's term when Zachary Taylor dies of natural causes in 1850, and all Millard Fillmore does is fill in the next 2 years. So he's doubly unimportant. There are many presidents during that time period who were elected, served their 4 years, and left having accomplished nothing, like Franklin Pierce. James Buchanan is such a hopeless failure that he doesn't go in the category of unimportant presidents, he goes in the category of total loser presidents.
How many of those are there?
A very long list of total loser presidents, and a list of great presidents that doesn't quite fit on one hand. If you want to, unless you want to, because many Democrats are not going to put Ronald Reagan on that list of great presidents. And he basically is number 5. Okay. Since even Thomas Jefferson, some people wonder nowadays whether he should be a great president. If you want to be really, really generous, you can get that list up to about 6. Bad presidents, 12 to 18. Are you sure? What's the lesson there? Our leaders have not made this country a great country. We've made this country a great country, despite of our pathetic leadership. Continually, despite of bad leadership, we do well because of the country. Okay, good. Wonderful. All right, moving along. All right. So after getting the Report on National Credit passed in 1790, some money is now going to begin to flow into the government, treasury, I might say. Except you can say the word treasury all you want. That doesn't create an organization or a building, which we did not have. Any kind of agency or organization with the federal government that would be collecting revenue due the government and dispensing the revenue to whoever the government should go to. We didn't have anything like that whatsoever. Certainly not. And so Alexander Hamilton decided to create a brand new government agency, an extremely powerful government agency, virtually a 4th branch of the government, not mentioned in the Constitution in the slightest, probably not even envisioned by the Founding Fathers. And this is only 3 or 4 years after the Constitution is written. We're already trying to stomp on it or improve it according to what your position is. Thomas Jefferson would say Alexander Hamilton's already stomping and ripping the Constitution up into pieces before it's had a chance for the first branches to grow out of the root. Alexander Hamilton would say, I'm just improving the document. You didn't think that the document would never be allowed to be changed again. It's set in stone. It should be allowed to grow as the country does. And this was called the Report on a National Bank. This was passed by the Congress in 1791, creating an organization which was known as the Bank of the United States, a national bank. A national bank which would have overwhelming control over the American economy and a very, very powerful role within our government at the same time. This Bank of the United States is going to be created. It's going to exist for 40 years, and then it's going to come to an end. We have nothing like it in the United States today. If we did, it would overwhelmingly dominate all of our lives. And yet the Bank of the United States played a very important role in getting this country off to a fast economic start.
How similar was that to the Fed?
The federal, that's an excellent question. As a matter of fact, I'll be answering that in a minute. One of the many powers and responsibilities of the bank, you're now, what the heck, just... Here we go. It was to be, that question is so clear, I should just start reading my lecture notes. All right, we'll repeat myself. That is the danger of a really good question.
Okay, well, I can read.
That's all right. It was to be, first of all, the depository for all national revenues. All tax dollars collected from selling money out west, or the tariff on imported goods, or selling bonds, the Bank of the United States, all that money would be deposited in the Bank of the United States. We didn't have a treasury, it would be our treasury, as well as many other things as well. So it's also what we call today the IRS, and the Treasury, and the Federal Reserve.
So it's just basically way too many places to keep on.
Plus a private bank, not controlled by the government, run by a board of directors made up of the chief investors in the bank, who then appoint a bank director, who is entirely a private position, not chosen by anyone in the government whatsoever. It would be the largest private bank in America and the largest government institution, all rolled into one. This is Alexander Hamilton thinking big, big. This institution will be strong enough to keep the American government going and to keep our economy going and growing. This will be the institution that will loan money to all other banks. This will make our currency solvent because people will see that the Bank of the United States is a bank that cannot go bankrupt because every year it gets to collect every penny of the government's taxes, and that money goes directly into the bank's vaults as its investment capital. So now we will have a powerful financial institution pumping literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in the American economy, because back then a dollar was an awful lot. And $100,000 was the $1 billion of 200 years ago. All right. We buy the Louisiana Purchase for $40 million. How much money would that be in modern American money? Probably $40 billion. Very, very cheap still. $40 billion for half of America, it's certainly more than that. Okay. All right. Probably worth $400 billion. After all, when you buy stuff like that, you get a discount. Okay. Yeah. It would be in charge of issuing our gold and silver currency, for example. So it's also whichever department of the government is in charge of issuing our currency today. The Treasury Department. There you go. Okay. So the Secretary of Treasury is not going to be in charge of those things. The President of the Bank of the United States is going to be. Okay. Of course, who's the Secretary of Treasury who's creating this organization? Alexander Hamilton. Okay. Yeah. I don't have enough power constitutionally to do the things that we need to do. So let's create a supra-constitutional organization that does have the power to do these things. All right. It would improve and then regulate the availability of credit. That is investment capital that a young, growing country needs to expand. We need to create lots of new businesses and new farms. Those people are going to need to borrow money. The banking system as it existed then was infantile, primitive, and unworkable. The Bank of the United States would streamline all of that and make credit available. The Bank of the United States would have all the powers of a gigantic privately owned bank, the Federal Reserve, and the IRS all rolled into a single, extremely powerful agency. The Congress once again thought to themselves and said they are of two minds. Hamilton, this is a brilliant idea, you rat bastard. It's scary. Is this exactly what we're talking about? Freedoms and liberty? Isn't this going to be a powerful organization? Sure, it'll create economic growth, but wow, it's just a little scary to go this whole way. So Hamilton did another idea. When you come up with a big idea and the people are thinking about voting for it, but a little worried about it, scale it back in size or time. And Hamilton decided to scale it back in time. What he said is, all right, why don't you just give it a 20-year trial run, a 20-year charter. That every 20 years the Bank of the United States would be up for renewal. If after 20 years, and it's obviously done a good job helping the country grow, keep it around. If after 20 years you think it's an economic dictator, get rid of it. That made it okay, and the Congress passed it. And obviously you can now figure out that after its first 20 years it expired, it got its charter renewed, but after it had been existed in 40 years, the president's name was Andrew Jackson, and he hated the Bank of the United States, and he made sure to destroy it once and for all. The result of that was a massive depression. 4-year economic collapse. But there you go. Told you didn't like Andrew Jackson. And we'll be getting to him in Chapter 10. Okay. Now, the plain fact was that the report on national credit had shaken the Congress up, but not so much that it split into factions. Washington is of two minds to whether to even sign this bill into law. A, he agrees along with Hamilton that this is a good idea. But B, he also understands Thomas Jefferson's recommendation that this is going too far, that he, as a member of the administration, cannot support it, that he won't be able to stay in the administration for the second term if it's passed, that he will form an opposition party, that people who oppose the Bank of the United States think it's a demonic idea to destroy our democracy and freedom and create a kind of elitist, upper class, Mason-run organization to keep control of the country from the beginning. So it's going to be divisive, which is the one thing Washington didn't want to do, to be divisive. But he doesn't know what to do. Not only that, but whoever's advice he takes, the other guy's going to quit. He sides with Alexander Hamilton. He signs the bill into law. And the Bank of the United States is created. And so is the division that will lead to the contested multi-party election of 1796. The Federalist Party are people who support Alexander Hamilton's ideas and support the Bank of the United States. The opponents of the Federalists are led by Thomas Jefferson, and they oppose the idea of the Bank of the United States. That is the example of everything that to them that's wrong with Federalist ideas. Not only are they bad about everything else, but look, they created this monster, the Bank of the United States. If you're scared of this institution, then vote for me, Thomas Jefferson, and my, what we're going to call Democratic Republicans. Although what he would have called Republicans, which was the name of the people who supported revolutions. The people who supported the French Revolution in France are called the Republicans. They opposed monarchs. They're in favor of a republic and democracy. Okay, very good. Now, George Washington had a very difficult decision to make in 1792, whether to run for re-election, because he was getting very old and experiencing mounting health problems. He was worried about setting the absolute worst possible precedent, example for a democracy, and that is that once a leader is elected leader, he should stay leader until he dies of old age. That's kind of like a monarchy, isn't it? So he didn't want to run for a second term. But Jefferson and Hamilton convinced him that if he didn't, the country was going to prematurely tear itself apart. And that we weren't ready for a multi-party election. The country might not survive it. So for the good of national unity, President Washington decided to A, serve a second term, and then B, try real hard to not die during those 4 years. And so he leaves office in 1797, and he stays alive until early 1799, when he does inevitably experience the results of old age and drop dead. After his doctors had drained 2 pints of blood out of him, because he got sick, which is what they used to, even as late as 1800, a doctor was an instant death certificate. They knew nothing about medicine, and all they would do is get you infected and dead with relentless bloodletting and leech applications. With this concept of the 4 humors, which is from ancient Greek and Roman times. Almost all modern medicine advances have occurred in the last 150 years. Okay, when they started learning about germs, then they started to actually heal patients. Yeah, instead of kill them, like they killed George Washington. So Benjamin Franklin's great advice: you want to stay healthy, stay away from doctors. Well, there you go. It's not really a good advice anymore, but it was back then. Okay, doctors have gotten much better, and they get paid a lot better too. You know, during Washington's entire 8 years in office, he only proposed 4 laws. Hamilton's three big reports, the third of which we didn't talk about, commerce and industry, because it was not passed, and the whiskey tax, which unfortunately was passed. So he only introduced 4 laws in 8 years, and only 2 of them passed, and 3 of them passed, and one of them was a horrifically bad idea. Now he's batting 500. In baseball, that's really good. In politics, it's pretty good as well. But he certainly wasn't a man who was jumping from one idea to another. And as you can see, Hamilton basically forced him into all of the big ideas. Washington would have never come up with any of these ideas himself, certainly. And he only used the power of veto twice. Now let's talk about the biggest mistake he made. Right at the end of his first term, the 25% excise tax on domestic whiskey. An excise tax is a sales tax. Domestic whiskey would be whiskey produced where? In America. Domestic means 2 things. It means in your country or in your home. If you hire a domestic, you have hired someone to work in your home. Just another example of how the English language is always using the same word to mean many different things. In this case, at least related.
Oh! Speaking of that, I thought, well, my friend told me of a word that means more than one thing. Banco. It's like...
In Spanish?
Yes.
Banco.
It's bank, like school, and like a river bank.
And it's also a thing you shout out in a gambling game. Banco. Right? What's that game? What's that game? James Bond used to play it with the passing of the shoe all the time, and I don't know how to play it. Bunko. That's what it's called, isn't it? With the shoe, and you get to play in this game, you get to be the dealer, and the person who's winning gets to be the dealer, and everybody bets on whether you're going to win or not.
Craps?
No, it's not it. It's playing cards. Oh well.
No idea.
It's not a popular game anymore for some reason. Everybody picked up on Texas. What people used to play before Texas Hold'em.
Check.
No. That's not that. Those are not similar games.
Oh, Baccarat?
Baccarat.
Baccarat.
Okay.
That's right. That's it. Yeah. And what do they actually shout?
I don't know.
Oh, correct. All right. Okay. You see, Hamilton's decision to sell the national debt as bonds was going to inevitably solve our financial problems. But like many solutions, there was a short-term shortfall. That the bonds didn't sell as fast as he hoped. And in those early 1790s, the government is continuing to run in the red. And so he needs to find some kind of a tax increase to cover government expenses. He wants to float the debt. He does not want the debt to spin out of control. Debt spins out of control. People lose confidence in the government and not buy our bonds. It's a delicate game you play with bonds. You want a debt so you can sell it, but not a debt that's so high that people won't be willing to buy it anymore. Because the day that no one wants to buy an American bond anymore is the end of the American dream. I promise you that. So let's just hope the Chinese keep buying. Because the Chinese people themselves are starting to grumble. They say, why is the government spending so much of our surplus on American bonds instead of investing the money in China? The government has an answer for that, but you have to have a college degree to understand the answer. And it has to be in economics. If you're just a worker, they might eventually rise up themselves and say, no more. Spend the money here in China. I would have no problem. It sounds logical to me. Okay. And so Hamilton came up with a win-win solution. And let me tell you what, as a pragmatist, I want to tell you one thing about when politicians say, I've got a solution that's going to make everyone happy. Run for the exits as soon as humanly possible. Because they blow up in your face. Because as a relative elitist who had never really been a farmer in his whole life, Alexander Hamilton, like many Federalists, had a rather priggish, fundamentalist attitude towards alcohol. They thought it was naughty. And you should not drink it. They thought it was morally wrong. Federalists are fundamentalists in their moral positions. They believe that the government should pass laws to improve public morals and make us into better humans, better Protestant humans, of course, by which they mean their Protestant morality, by which they mean they believe that alcohol is a religious sin, which would mean that Christ the Lord sinned every day of his adult life, especially whenever he went into a village and the sinners invited to a party, which he always attended. Never lived with the honest people, always housed with the sinners. They drink more than the rest. He would have drank every gulp offered. Of course, back then, what other choice did you have? Everything else was unsafe to drink. It's what alcohol was originally invented for. The fermenting process means it's safe. Okay. No, he didn't drink grape juice. That was invented by a man named Welch's in the 1850s. I'm sorry. Although he was so poor, they probably mixed that with a lot of water. The poor mixed their wine with a lot of water. 4 parts at least, 3 parts for the nice days. The rich didn't mix it with anything else, and it was basically an instant virtual death certificate. It's 150 proof wine. Okay, that's what Alexander Hamilton, Alexander the Great drank right to the grave. Okay, died of alcohol poisoning. All right, enough of that. So Hamilton thinks that whiskey's bad in the first place. In addition, he knows that farmers produce a lot of it in America. So a 25% tax on whiskey would solve the government's budget problems and make us all better people by forcing us to drink less, like the cigarette tax. But his political radar has failed him now. He's made a terribly bad political move that the American people are not going to accept. Most of the time, it's not even going to be enforced. And when and where it is enforced, it's going to lead to an armed rebellion against the American government, with the civilians taking up weapons and opening fire at their own government. Now, certainly those rebels are rebels. They're bad and naughty, and they're going to have to be put down with force by the American government. But you don't want to have to do that, do you? Your leaders don't want to have to put down their own people with armed force if they don't have to, and you tend to blame whoever is responsible for whatever law was passed for causing a rebellion for making a big mistake. Okay, so this is a gigantic mistake that Alexander Hamilton made, the mistake that gave him a bad reputation, that made him so unpopular that in later years he could not run for president, even though every single Federalist idea he'd come up with himself. He had what we would call today high negatives. And I'll talk about that a little more in just a moment, what that means, what it means to have high positives and high negatives. Some of you may have heard of those phrases before, and now you're going to find out what it actually means. You realize when you're a farmer, especially back then before railroads, you could be a lucky farmer who happened to own land near a big city, so you could get your surpluses easily to marketplace and make enough money to live a better life over time and improve and pass on a nicer farm to your children. Or you could live out and farther out in the wilderness, maybe up in the Appalachians. Maybe you're one of those farmers who's already settled west of the Appalachians, and half of Pennsylvania is west of the Appalachians. It's right, the Appalachian Mountains run right through the center of Pennsylvania, more or less, don't they? Okay. And those farmers could never get bulky products like grain across the Appalachians, even though they aren't that high. Can you imagine the extra expenses that would ratchet up as you tried to take your surplus across a mountain range, packed to mules? By the time you made it to Philadelphia, would your grain be sellable at a price that customers would want? Local farmers would undercut you.
Because they don't have to pay the cost of transportation.
They would not have to pay the cost of transportation, so you're screwed. Except you don't sell bulk grain from a farm in western Pennsylvania. You build yourself a primitive still and turn it into whiskey. You buy a little sugar, you've got wood everywhere around you to create the fire for the fuel, and so you process that into whiskey, which you can easily put an entire wagon load of whiskey, take it to Philadelphia. Why, that could be 2 years worth of, you can make some good money on that. You just know they can make some good money on a wagon full of whiskey in Philadelphia or anywhere. All right, so large numbers of farmers, actually their profit margin, making their farm survive, depended on their sale of whiskey. And Hamilton, as a man who had never been a farmer or ever probably knew one, probably didn't even know anyone who was going to tell him the negative consequences. He just arrogantly thought he'd come up with a great idea. Now, there are going to have to be revenue men. Revenue men are government-employed people who go around to make sure that people pay their taxes. And generally, what tended to happen around the country outside of western Pennsylvania is the old-fashioned way Americans would treat the revenue man. Honey, I see the revenue man coming. Get my rifle. Wham! A couple of shots over his head. He turns around and runs away. End of tax payment. Okay, that was the old-fashioned way to deal with revenue man. You're a revenuer. Here comes a revenuer. Granny's going to get her gun and give you some, of course, Granny would always ask for, what do you put in your gun? You don't actually want to kill him? Buckshot. Buckshot. Wham! Just an extreme serious laceration. Okay. But in western Pennsylvania, there were a number of extremely tough revenue men who would not take no for an answer. Farmers who did not pay their excise, 25% excise tax, began having their farms seized, foreclosed, and sold at auction. When a neighbor's farm is foreclosed by the government, all the other farmers feel that they are next. And they were all veterans. They got their rifles, just like Shays' Rebellion. These are men who have already fought in a war against a previous government because they were told that it is legitimate to rise against a bad government with bad laws. So they now saw the American government as a bad government with bad laws and launched the Whiskey Rebellion, which occurred in 1794. It's only a couple hundred people. Not that many people were killed. It wasn't that much of a rebellion. But remember, we didn't even have an army back then. That's what the reason for the Second Amendment. So Washington had to call forth a national militia, got together 12,000 volunteers, marched them across the Appalachians into the western half of Pennsylvania, where those people had seceded from the United States and declared themselves independent, and brought them back under U.S. control with armed forces, arrested a couple dozen of the leaders, and some people were executed. It made Alexander Hamilton look really bad. Okay. And of course, once Thomas Jefferson's Republicans do finally get into power in 1800, one of the very first things they do is repeal the whiskey tax, which they think was wrong. There should not be internal taxes. The federal government should not have taxed the American people directly. To this very day, can we all agree that there is no federal sales tax? And that you never pay any money to the federal government whenever you buy a product? There is no federal sales tax. That is only state and local. There is only a federal income tax. Yes. Okay. So you can imagine if nowadays we would scream foul if the federal government implemented some kind of a nationwide sales tax, how angry it must have made people in the 1790s when government was oh so very, very small and people had very little stomach for government intervention. You guys have no concept of how small. The federal government is the size of this room today. The federal government was like the size of the tip of a pin. Maybe only a few hundred employees at that time. In the entire federal government, just a few hundred employees. Through the entire 19th century, only a few thousand employees at most times. By World War I, a few tens of thousands of employees. By the Depression, hundreds of thousands of employees. By World War II, millions of federal employees. Today, a few tens of millions of federal employees that work in the United States, the largest employer of the federal government. Okay. Now, we can cover the election of 1796, because George Washington is certainly not going to run for a third term. He's too old. Okay. Matter of fact, in his farewell address, the last speech an American president gives, often on his last day in the presidency, is called the farewell address. It's also called something else, isn't it? He recommended, as the father of our country, that voluntarily no president should ever serve more than 2 terms, period. A recommendation that all American presidents followed until Franklin Roosevelt, who was the first candidate to run for more than 2 terms. And after he left the White House, the Congress added an amendment, and the country passed an amendment to the Constitution limiting all future presidents to 2 terms. So we will never have a president who was longer than Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, very good. So, as a result, we're going to have the creation of our first 2-party system. One political party called the Democratic Republicans, primarily associated with Thomas Jefferson, who was running Thomas Jefferson for president, and other men as well. The political parties were so new, they didn't even know yet to hold a convention and just nominate one person. Each party nominated a number of men. For example, the Democratic Republicans ran Jefferson because they knew he would get lots of votes in the South, and ran Aaron Burr to get votes in New York, and even ran some Yankees to get some votes in New England. Then I guess they hadn't thought through quite which of these guys would get to be president. Okay. Our first presidential elections, one of the things we were doing is figuring out how to hold multi-party elections. We did not quite have it correct right away. For example, we don't know the total number of votes for the election of 1796 or 1800. They didn't count the votes total nationwide. They counted them within the counties. Each county got a certain number of votes for its state, and then each state decided who had won, who was going to get how many delegates in the Electoral College. So the only numbers we have are the Electoral College numbers. Okay. And which candidates won which counties. Yes?
How long did it take to tabulate the results?
Yeah, it took a while. That's one of the reasons why back then you held the election the first Tuesday of November, and then the man did not get inaugurated president until the 3rd week of March the next year for a over 4-month lame duck period when you'd have one man in the White House who wasn't really president anymore. It took us a long, it wasn't until after Franklin Roosevelt that we changed that to a just 2-month layover, where we have the presidential election this first Tuesday of November, and then January 20th, inaugurate the new president. Used to inaugurate the president March 21st, the first day of spring. Yeah, that was a long time. That caused our country a lot of trouble. Like in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln's elected president, the first Tuesday of November, the whole South secedes from the Union. What can Lincoln do about it until March 21st? Nothing. He's not even really president yet. Just that rat bastard James Buchanan who did nothing at all. Let the whole country disintegrate. All right. So that, and in the modern world, you just can't let that happen. But back then, that kind of stuff took a long time. Okay. Like the Congress didn't meet that often. If you were the senator from Georgia, that was a bit of a horse ride, wasn't it, from Washington, D.C. to Georgia? You didn't want to take that more than 2 or 3 times a year, did you? You know. Okay. Yeah. Then imagine later on, like in the 1850s, if you were the senator from California, before the rails. That was a long journey to take up your Senate post. You didn't want to go back home that often, you know, during those 6 years. Okay. Then the Democrat candidates were not just Thomas Jefferson, but also James Madison was running for president. He's almost as famous as Thomas Jefferson, and just as opposed to the Bank of the United States. The man wrote the Constitution virtually, and Madison will become our 4th president after Thomas Jefferson, our 3rd president. And Aaron Burr, who's a Yankee. He's from New York. So he is the Democratic Republican candidate trying to attract votes up north from men who might not be willing to vote for a Virginian like Jefferson or Madison. Meanwhile, why don't we do it that way? Why don't we keep the categories across and go party, go back and forth that way, as if I were creating a chart. Democratic, Republican candidates, regions of support, states that reach types of voters, then domestic issues and foreign policy. Okay. The Federalists, most famous Federalists I mentioned before, were Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. But Washington's too old, and Hamilton is too unpopular. He said having high negatives. When pollsters ask people about possible candidates to run for president, they want to find out how many people have positive things to say about you. First of all, how many people know you exist, and how many people say good things about you. How many people know you exist but don't like you. If large numbers of people know who you exist and like you, you have high positives. If large numbers of people know you and don't like you, you have high negatives. If you've been around in politics for a long time, your negatives are going to go up, aren't they? Just because people know you. Hillary Clinton was well known in 2008. She'd been around since 1992 in the American psychology. She had high positives and high negatives. There were many people who disliked her. How high do you think Obama's negatives were in 2008? How could they be high? No one had heard about him or knew anything about him except that he seemed like a nice guy. So he had very high positives but no negatives because he'd never been around very long. He was so a newcomer has the advantage. Alexander Hamilton has very high negatives. Can we not agree? Yeah. But what about John Adams? He's as famous, a very important founder, signing the Declaration of Independence, signing the Constitution, one of the most important, powerful politicians in New England. He doesn't have any negatives at all. High positives. So he's a better candidate. But he wasn't the only candidate the Federalists ran. They also ran many different men, especially, for example, Thomas Pinckney, Pinckney. He ran for president as a Federalist many times. And some other names not as important. Okay. Where were the two parties the strongest? Where did they get most of their votes? Well, as we're about to find out, from the very beginning, the Republican Party, that today is called the Democrats, the Democratic Republican Party, are there more Democratic voters in America today or Republican? Oh, I know, this is a tough thing for you Texans to be able to spit out of your mouth and speak it. That's right. Thank you, Sean. I had to say it. Yes, there are and always have been more Democratic voters in America than Republicans. Always. Okay, they've always been the larger party with the more open groups.
Even before Roosevelt?
Yes. I will say even then, okay, they have always been the larger party. And yet, because that allows me to teach a lesson, you do not have to be the majority party to win elections. All you have to do is blame the country's problems on the majority party. And then you can come to power. You better believe it, okay? Matter of fact, being the majority party can be a burden. You've got so many people that you have to support and who are expecting things from you. All right? And as we're about to find out, the Democratic Republicans were always larger than Federalists. And yet, who wins the election of 1796?
Federalists.
Federalists do. So it allows me to teach that very important lesson. Why are the Federalists going to win this election when everything points to the Democratic Republicans? It has nothing to do with cheating, because back then both parties cheated equally. Okay. You were expected back then to vote for whoever your social betters told you to vote for. And if you didn't, you might be voting for them anyway because your social betters are counting the ballots. There was, children did what their parents told them to do. Poor people did what rich people told them to do. Citizens did what leaders told them to do. That was the old morality. Okay. All right. Moving on. Because the Democrats were always very strong in the South. Remember, Federalists believe in improving public morals, and many of them have questions about the morality of slavery. Democratic Republicans believe the government has no role in your private lives, including telling you what to do with your own slaves. They're your property. Freedom. Okay. Well, you might even have the freedom to have sex with all your female slaves. Jefferson. I'm looking at you, Jefferson. Okay, in the room. I mean, there are reasons why no one ever seems to visit the Jefferson Monument anymore, and why we put it off on the side in the first place. Okay, have you seen that Simpsons episode where Lisa's trying to ask the Lincoln Monument a question, but she can't be heard because everyone is always bombarding him with questions? Help, help, help. So she goes over to Jefferson, and Jefferson's so lonely, he starts asking Lisa, "Oh, don't leave, Lisa! I'm so lonely! No one will talk to me." Oh, well. The South, not just Virginia. Virginia's the biggest state in the South, but in the country, and it's in the South. But also deep South states like Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee. They always vote Democratic, Republican. So did frontiersmen. So as new states are added to the Union, like Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio, most of those people are Democrat, Republican. Yes. Meanwhile, the Federalist stronghold was basically only the New England states. Although there are a lot of them if you count them out, Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Vermont. Many of those, except for Massachusetts, have very small populations, very small numbers in the Electoral College. You take the smaller ones, minus Massachusetts, and they probably have fewer delegates than Virginia alone. At this time, you can't possibly win the White House with New England alone. It's only going to get you 1/3 of the way. They also expected to win New Jersey. And since they have no chance of ever winning a southern state, if they want to get their candidate elected, they have to win the swing states. There have always been swing states. Swing states are states that tend to swing between parties and can't be expected to always be in one camp. Nowadays, those are the states that get all the campaign money for commercials. If you haven't noticed, it's been, I can't remember the last time I saw a presidential commercial on Texas television. Because we are always going to be in the Republican camp, aren't we? So why would the Republicans spend any money for commercials like McKay when he knew he was going to win Texas? Shouldn't he spend his money on the swing states? And Obama knows he's going to lose Texas. So why should he spend even a penny here? Except to get donations. And so what are the two or three most famous swing states in America today? Ohio, and of course the most swingest of all the swing states, not New York. Florida, where presidential elections are determined, aren't they, nowadays? Okay, well back then it was New York and Pennsylvania, and especially New York. Second biggest state, New York City. Because as we're about to find out, separate from states, let's talk about social groups. Everyday farmers tended to vote Democrat. And we had a word, we've already used it. What is the name for an everyday farmer who's not rich, not poor, owns his own land?
Yeoman.
Yeoman. Yeoman farmers vote Democrat. They don't understand Alexander Hamilton and his slimy East Coast banker ideas about the Bank of the United States and selling bonds. Everything that comes out of Alexander Hamilton's mouth scares the farmers. He's just big city-ish at a time when almost all Americans are yeoman small farmers. And only very small numbers of Americans are businessmen or work for businessmen in cities where obviously Hamilton's ideas would be supported. So, for example, the big city people always voted Federalist no matter where they lived. So German and Dutch speakers in upstate New York would all vote Democrat, but the people of New York City voted Federalist. And New York City has always been a significant portion of the population of New York State. So there gives the Federalists have a chance to win that state. The farmers of Pennsylvania are all going to be yeomans. They're going to vote Democrat, but Philadelphia is an important part of Pennsylvania, and the people of Philadelphia vote Federalist. Why, even the South. The South might be overwhelmingly Democratic Republican, but the people of Charleston, that's a city, they're Federalists. Charleston would vote Federalist, for example. But there aren't that many big cities. I think I mentioned almost all of them, except for Boston. Now let's talk about political beliefs. And I may have already written this chart up on the board, but I'm going to do it again, because remember, I'm really trying to make you guys more intelligent by improving your vocabulary. I believe that if I build your vocabulary, I will have benefited you for your entire life. But what are the odds 1 or 2 years from now, if I were to pull you off the street and give you a test, how much of the material would you still remember? 15%. They already did a study. 10 to 15%. But if I build your vocabulary, what happens if you learn a word and use it 3 times within 24 hours of learning it? You learn it, you know it for the remainder of your life until you get Alzheimer's. Okay. You don't use it within 24 hours, what happens? You don't remember what it means. You lose it. Okay, so you got to use those big words. Just use them a couple of times in a day, and they're there for you the rest of your life. And a lot of times in these test questions, they have things like, let's try this. Here's the big word. Ideology is to blank as faith is to religion. That's how they do vocabulary in multiple choice, don't they? Okay. Which is really easy, by the way. I can always figure out this. Even if you don't know what the word means, you should be able to figure it out from this logic equation. Ideology is to blank as faith is to religion. What's the answer? Philosophy? No. Have we been talking about philosophy in this class? What have we been talking about?
Politics?
Everything I talk about is what I'm talking about. Okay? I never switch gears to start talking about something else. This is a political lecture, so it's going to be politics. That would be a philosophy class. Yes, ideology is to politics as faith is to religion. If I ask you what your ideology is, I'm asking you what your politics are. Are you a liberal or conservative? Are you a Republican or a Democrat? Okay. If I ask you what your faith is, I'm asking you what your religion is, and isn't it? And these are how you use the English language. You do not ask somebody what their religious ideology is. That is an unacceptable usage, and no one can have faith in politics. There, see, I worked it out. I got a joke out of it. There you go. But that's how you use or misuse the English language. And if I find misused words in your essays, you don't know what you're talking about. And you don't get any points for that sentence, because you mangle it all up. You're trying really hard. I feel for you, but still don't give you any points. Okay. Misspelled is better in my mind than misused words and not know what they mean, because I can't spell anyway. I'm going to punish you. If you misspell a word so bad that I could see you misspelled it, wow. Because I probably can't even read your handwriting well enough to tell that you've misspelled the word. but I can probably figure out what the word is. Okay, so we're going to talk about ideology. And ideology today is left and right. But you know, the thing about that is really liberal and conservative are the better words. But there is a third word as well that's hard to deal with. And we're going to have to deal with all those words because there were no liberals back at this time. This is a 20th century idea, liberalism, the way we think about it. Back then, there were just conservatives who believed that we should have a big government and that it should have a role in everything from economics to morality. And libertarians like Thomas Jefferson that believe we should have the smallest government possible. And there should be no role at all for the government in things like how I run my own business or how I run my own life with my own family. Not only do I have a right to own slaves, but I can drink all I want and beat my wife and children. This is America. Freedom. Okay, and you're certainly not going to interfere in any of that, because boy, you better believe it, that when they got drunk, they beat their wives and kids. Maybe they didn't own any slaves. Maybe they already beaten their slaves, I don't know. All right, so good enough. Maybe they did need some improvement in morality. I never know. All right, so the Democrats and Republicans had very libertarian ideals. Libertarians tend to trust the common man and see the common person as the good guy and the government as the bad guy that's trying to take away your rights and freedoms. And we should all be that way. I mean, shouldn't you be willing to go up to any stranger and hand them your wallet, your purse, and your one-year-old baby and say, I got to go do something, can you watch these for 6 hours, I'll come right back? Don't you trust people? Because the answer is no. You don't trust them. But sometimes politicians act like somehow we would. Thomas Jefferson was one of those guys who's always willing to talk about how wonderful Americans are. When he entered the White House in 1800, I might as well tell you this now, so I won't tell it to you later. One of the things, he wanted to be seen as a regular guy. John Adams and Washington were all a bunch of elitists who looked down on common people as little snuts. And Jefferson was going to be an honest man, look you in the eye. And he held a great big banquet that he invited any American to come in. The White House had just been completed. And they brought out everything. And when it was over, every single piece of silverware in the White House had been stolen. Everything was gone. Jefferson, of course, didn't say anything about it. He was quietly restocked. When you're a Democrat and the people let you down, you pretend like they haven't let you down. You better pretend that way. Okay, because you're not a Republican, you can't act like one. You have to accept those kind of things. Okay. They believed that government was dangerous to liberty. It should be kept as small as possible. Government that governs least governs best. And when it came to economics, they have a very rustic. How about this word? R-U-S-T-I-C. It has a couple of meanings. What does it mean if I'm not insulting you? And what does it mean if I am insulting you?
The only time I know rustic is used like an interior design.
Yeah, okay, so what does it mean then? For rustic design. If you were to decorate your house rustic.
Cozy country kind of.
That's right. Country. Rustic is a nice word for, if you call it countryside, pretty trees and hills and a pretty farm and a cow moo. Or it means rural, hick, backwoods, no education, loser people. Okay, whichever you want, however you want to use that word. Rustic. That Democratic Republicans had a very simplistic concept of politics in the first place. And they're very simplistic. They just wanted government out of their lives. They were just scared of the idea of the Bank of the United States. Didn't understand the idea of bonds. It terrified them. Okay? And men like Jefferson could play off of that fear to get elected. The very idea we should pay off our debt, not loan it to the rich, as it were, seemed like conniving to them. All right. So they deeply opposed the Bank of the United States on moral grounds alone. They saw it as immoral and inimical to freedom. All right. Meanwhile, the Federalists have very elitist ideals. The kind of belief system that is guaranteed did not get you elected in America today, which no politicians would present even if they had those secret opinions, if you let the American people see that you're acting as if the upper class are simply genetically superior to the rest of us, blue bloods, they used to call them, we don't like it too much. Matter of fact, that's maybe Charles and I are the only ones old enough to remember what killed the original George Bush presidency. Eventually, we decided that George Bush was an elitist. Remember when he decided to go shopping to show, because you know, rich people never shop. Because they spend their entire life, they don't go to a store to buy things. Other people buy those things for them. They don't know how much things cost. It was 1991 and George Bush he'd gone to a store to buy a pair of socks. And when he was there, he freaked out. There was a laser scanner. He'd never seen one before in his life. He still thought, because last time he bought anything was 1938, ka-ching, sale. Okay, and all of a sudden we realized he was an elitist. He was an elitist. He wasn't like one of us, you know. The common people are bad. Hamilton called them a great beast, easily deluded. They'll vote for anyone who offers them a chicken in every pot, 50 acres and a mule. Just make the people any promise. They're so stupid they'll vote for you that they won't even pay attention afterwards when you don't give them what you promise. And you can make the same promise again the next time and they'll vote for you again. The only reason we have democracy is so not to have dictatorship. Because democracy is smelly, like common people. Because they don't bathe. Okay. Elitists believe that you have to have respect for authority. That you need law and order to have a decent society people would want to live in. What's most important is the laws are enforced and the people live quiet little lives. A strong government closely tied to the interests of the rich is the best government because it's going to survive. They also believed that the government had a role in stimulating economic growth. The government should have a role in stimulating economic growth, should create government programs and spend money on economic projects. Certainly Democratic Republicans would have been against that. The government should do nothing at any time and just leave the free enterprise system alone, especially his darling slavery.
You had to be a property owner to vote.
And you had to be a property owner to vote in most states, although those were now beginning to disappear. And by this time, at least half of the states no longer had a property. No, they were reducing the property requirement to a farm. Back then, if you were homeless, even today, should homeless people really, if you think about it, be allowed to vote? Wouldn't they vote for anyone who promises them $1? Because they don't have $1? But obviously, they have the right to vote and should. And how many homeless people do you think remember to register to vote so they can vote on voting day? Do they have an address? Don't you have to have an address to register to vote? So they can't vote? Because they have no address. Okay. So there you go.
Should they put their addresses to homeless shelters?
I guess they could. And I'll bet 1% of them do. Okay. After all, only half of all Americans vote in the first place. Okay, so the percentage of homeless people, they have every reason, understandable reasons not to vote. Yeah, including not having a home district to vote in. Well, I guess the homeless shelter. Yeah, but nobody who likes to, they don't even like to stay there. I would never make a home. I would rather not have an address to put in a shelter. My address. I'd put underneath a bridge on Stevens. Okay. You know, all right. Actually, no way, because when this fails, I'm just going to go and live the rest of my life on a beach in San Diego. Beach in San Diego. Of course, now it's too late. They've cut all the fancy government programs in California that kept the homeless going. Those have all been eliminated because the California economy is collapsing. No free ride. I was counting on that free ride. All right. You know, Vice President John Adams. He was mocked by the Democratic Republicans because when he was vice president, the press had asked him, what should we call you? What do we call the vice president today if you ask the vice president a question? What do you say? Mr. Vice President. He said, call me His High Mightiness, Mr. Adams. Because the elitists, the Federalists believe that. These are our democratically elected leaders, just like kings, who are undemocratically elected leaders. They are your social betters. They don't have to tell you why they're issuing policies. They don't have to explain laws. They pass. A father doesn't have to explain why he's telling his children to do something. They just do. And a government doesn't have to explain itself to you. You are a citizen. It is the government has the power of law overhanging you. You do what the government tells you to do. Okay. A relatively un-American concept. And so we shouldn't be surprised that this party is not going to last very long. It's not very American. It's very old world in many of its concepts. And so we shouldn't feel sorry for how short-lived it's going to be. However, when it all comes down to it, there's something that, once again, me and Charles are probably the only people old enough and have voted in so many presidential elections to know a couple of things about them. A, almost never do you get to vote with a warm feeling in your heart because you really like the candidate. Almost always it's, I hate candidate B, A, and I hate candidate B even more than candidate A. Which one should I vote for? Vomit-inducing or just queasy? Okay.
You only have two choices.
I know.
But if you had more than one, then you could have a runoff. You could vote for the one you like, and then at the end, vote for
You see, he's talked about runoffs before, but I'm telling you, they won't work in our American system. Although we have them at the state level sometimes. And the second thing is that years before an election, if you ask people a couple years before an election what the most important issues are, they say things like education and health care or taxes or immigration. When it comes down to it, there's always a foreign policy crisis. We're almost at war. We are at war. And it's foreign policy decisions you have to make when you pick president, don't you? 2004, it was Iraq that was in our minds, wasn't it? Et cetera, et cetera. And so many times, it's foreign policy and questions of war and peace that trump all the other issues. And it is foreign policy that is basically going to give the Federalists the opportunity to smear Thomas Jefferson as a dangerous radical who will destroy our country if he becomes president, convince enough people that Thomas Jefferson is too dangerous to be president, and then people will hold their nose and vote for John Adams and the Federalists until he gets elected in a very close election. Now, foreign policy today, as always, has to do with important countries. Okay, I don't really care what America's policy is to Bolivia or Gambia. It's just not important countries. And back then, the two most important countries in the world were England and France. They were the only two countries that mattered. What would America's, our small little country, vulnerable at all times, to the machinations of more powerful nations like France and England, and what should our relationship be with them?
Friendly.
Or not necessarily. Do you think we should be friendly with the English? This was a very important question. Should we be friendly with our motherland, the English, who we just had a brutal divorce with in a revolution, and who many of us now see as the devil itself?
Civil at least.
Because, well, you know, you're starting to sound Federalist. Because, let me put it this, we'll put it this way. They'll start with the British. When it came to the British, the Democrats and Republicans were proudly boasted of their anti-British sentiments. Whereas the Federalists were damaged by the accusation of being secretly pro-British, embarrassingly pro-British. When you see, when the revolution began, don't you think there would have been many American merchants and British merchants who owed each other money as a result of economic activity? Didn't we gain almost all of our economic activity was with Great Britain before the revolution? Once the revolution broke out, as you might expect, we didn't pay any of our money we owed them, and they didn't pay any money they owed us. Now the war is over. We'd both like to renew trade relations, and both sides are arguing, demanding that their previous obligations be paid back. And both sides want I want the British to pay the debt they owe us, but we can't pay you. And the British want us to pay the debt they owe them first. We each want the other side to pay first. And so there's no agreement. And so during Washington's presidency, a famous American who would become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court just after this, John Jay, was sent to England to negotiate a trade treaty called Jay's Treaty, which we are not going to cover in this class because of my precedent. What's my rule about why I don't cover things?
It's in the book.
In the interest of time?
It what?
In the interest of time?
What happened to Jay's Treaty? Passed or rejected by the Senate?
Rejected.
We don't cover things that are rejected because things that don't become law don't become law and aren't important except in their absence.
Yeah.
What did Jay's Treaty do to America? Nothing. It wasn't passed. The Democratic Republicans refused to pass the treaty because it had some kissing up to the English. We'd pay them first, we'd pay them more, then they'd reward us by trading with us. New England desperately needed it, but the rest of the country felt that we were kissing up to the English, giving them too much. It was the Federalists opening the door for letting the English come and take us over again. Some people might have unfairly said. So, still, how come the Democratic Republicans lost and the Federalists won? It all had to do with our relationship with France and the French Revolution, which had already occurred by this time in 1789, the very famous year in French history. Everyone in America knows 1776. Everyone in France knows 1789. Everyone in England knows 1066. The year of the Norman Conquest, the Battle of Hastings, when the English were conquered by the French. So most countries, I guess everyone in Mexico knows 1817, is that the date?
I thought it was 1810. They just celebrated their bicentennial.
1811.
I think it's 1810.
1810. 1810. Correct. Not the year they achieved independence, but the year they declared independence.
Yeah,
like
whatever.
America does not celebrate 1783. We celebrate 1776. Very good. Okay. All right. France. Because the Federalists were proudly boastful that they had been opposed to what turned out to be a brutally violent and out-of-control, chaotic French Revolution that came to terrify Americans. And Democratic Republicans, and especially Thomas Jefferson, were embarrassed by their pro-French Revolution position and the things Thomas Jefferson had said. And when the Federalists figured out that they could use Thomas Jefferson's own words against him, that he was a bit of a loudmouth, that he had positions on every issue, and that many of his positions were extremely radical and almost dangerous. He had a long track record, and very quickly that gave him high negatives that the Federalists could use against him. Thomas Jefferson had been excited by the French Revolution and strongly in favor of it. He thought it was the American Revolution spreading to Europe. And for a couple of years, it was. But in the French Revolution, not only did the rich rise up against the king, but then the middle class rose up against the rich, and the poor rose up against the middle class. And once the poor took control, they took all the rich out and chopped them off their heads off, one by one, the guillotine, until tens of thousands of dead, wealthy people, businessmen, priests, everyone you could see, and the poor would scream their support. Yay, yay! At least we may still be poor, but the rich are now dead. That kind of revolution. Terrifying. The very thing Americans did not want to destroy our prosperity. And so that support really made the Democratic Republicans and Thomas Jefferson look dangerously radical. Don't pick him. He'll create too much change and destroy the country. Then they started pointing out all sorts of other things Thomas Jefferson had said. Like that statement that was on Timothy McVeigh's T-shirt when he blew up that government building in Oklahoma. Thomas Jefferson said that it would be a good idea to have a violent revolution every 20 years or so to preserve freedom. Do you agree with that? I don't agree with that. Our children to live peaceful lives. That's crazy. Or the Jefferson Bible. Remember, he didn't like the Bible. So he edited it, cut out parts, and rewrote other parts, and published it as the Jefferson Bible. Okay. A lot of people thought that was what it was. Insane. Okay. Oh, by the way, most of his inventions didn't work, and Monticello is a very poorly designed building. Okay, very poorly designed indeed. He wasn't all that brilliant, okay? He thought he was. Like Benjamin Franklin, America, the land of people who think they're really smart. Okay. And so that's it. As a result of this, the Federalists had their opportunity. Now, it's an extremely close election. Jefferson's going to win all the southern states. And get other delegates as well. He's going to win 68 electors. But Adams wins the election with 71. Because not only does he win New England, but also New Jersey and New York. And when you add New England and New Jersey and New York, you've got enough to become president. Okay? And when we come back to class on Tuesday, we'll find out that John Adams is going to have the first unsuccessful presidency, the first of many. And when he runs for re-election, he's going to lose. And that will happen to many candidates as well. Wonderful. Okay. Now, I'd like to talk to you first, and then we'll deal with all the students who still haven't taken the test, the B group.